Hey everyone, welcome to today's webinar on Boldface questions and how to solve them. I've just made the webinar available for broadcast, so of course we're going to have a couple of minutes in which people sign in, people get all of the technical gremlins out of the way, and it now says that it's 7:32, so we should be ready to start in earnest by about 7:34, 7:35. In the meantime, there are, excuse me. In the meantime, I just want to go over some of the ground rules so that, when we actually conduct the webinar, it can be done in the, most effective, smoothest possible way so that, one, we get through all the content that we need to and cover that effectively, and two, that, we actually get done on time. I don't want to, waste your Friday evening. Obviously, you might have had something better to do, but props to you for coming in and, attending this webinar. So, I want to make sure that you get the most out of it so that you're not held waiting for too long. And if you do have plans for later in the night, you can actually go ahead and take them up. So, a few things to point out is that you may see on your screen that there's certain things that you can do. You can open this Q&A tab to ask questions. You have a chat window that can be used for general, chat. And there's also this function that I presume says raise hand, but that function doesn't really work so well from our end. So essentially, if you hit raise hand, there's nothing that I can really do on my end to address the fact that you've done that. So, if you have a question yourself, put it on the Q&A. If you're looking to answer a question that I've asked, you can put it on the chat window. You'll also see that there are some polls available to you, and I'll make these polls available, or rather, I'll open up the polls to be answered, at various intervals so that you have some time to answer them correctly, and then we'll get into what the results of those polls are. In fact, since it's 7:34, what I can do is I will open poll number 1, and I'll keep it open a while. So please take it upon yourselves to answer the question for poll number 1. I'm going to launch it right now. And it's titled Boldface Strategy. The question says, how do you currently solve boldface questions? And there are a bunch of options for it. All right. Now that it's 7:35, I think, we've waited long enough, and there are almost 50 of you here now. So yeah, like I said before, props to all of you for coming in. And let's get started in earnest then. So a few ground rules so that we can, conduct this session in the most efficient manner. We can get the most out of what we're trying to do. How this will work is that if I ask you a question, unless I'm opening up a poll for it, if I ask you a question, put your answers on the chat window. If you have any questions, you can put them on the chat window as well, or alternatively, there's a Q&A tab and you can put it on the Q&A tab. If you find that that works better for you, absolutely go ahead and do that. What you may also find is that, sometimes, as is the case with internet in general, you may experience a lag at some point or the other. And if you find that you're experiencing a lag, ping me on the chat window. What I'll be able to test out then is I'll ask everyone if they're facing trouble or not. And if, it's a common problem, then there's probably something that I have to fix on my end. If there is no problem whatsoever, then it's probably something for you to fix on your end. In fact, let's try this out for a second, actually, shall we? If you can hear me just fine and you don't find that there are any technical problems, please type in 1 on the chat. If you see that there are some problems, please type in 2. Fantastic. I see a bunch of 1s coming in, so that presumably means that everything's working fine, and we've also ensured that you understand the process of how to use the chat window effectively. So that's great. 2 birds with 1 stone. Fantastic. All right. Now, the agenda for this session is overall 90 minutes. And if I'm being very honest, I would love for this to be done in 60 minutes with a little bit of time at the end for you to ask some questions. So, but in order for that to happen in the most effective manner, we want to make sure that we can actually get through the content quickly, that we can actually, just breeze through it. So let's keep that in mind, and let's try to be considerate of everybody's time so that we can do that in the most effective manner. Just one thing that I want to draw your attention to, I touched upon this right at the start, but the raise hand function is not something that works particularly well. So I see a couple of people hit the raise hand function. If you have a question of me or you have something that you want to say, just go ahead and say it on the chat window, right? And I think that will be a lot more effective. How we'll also do this is that I will pause at various intervals in order to take all of the questions that have come up until that point. It doesn't make sense for me to answer every question and break my flow as soon as it comes in. Put your questions in nonetheless, and at various intervals I'll stop and say, hey, okay, let's address all of the questions that you guys have. One thing that I do want you to keep in mind is that please try to ask questions that are relevant to the topic today. Like I said, we want to be respectful and we want to be considerate of everybody's time here, right? I see now that there are over 60 of you. So, we really want to make sure that we're not putting anyone else behind, through not being considerate or whatever. So before we dive into Boldface questions themselves, let me tell you a little bit about myself, right? I don't want to sound like I'm, doing a lot of self-promotion, but it's good for building some rapport. So my name is Matoo, right? So that's what it is. You can just call me Matoo. You don't have to call me anything else, right? I have a master's in economics. So I've studied economics all through my life since after high school. And yeah, master's from the University of Amsterdam. And there was a point in my life when I really wasn't sure what I wanted to do. And I was good at standardized tests. I've always been good at standardized tests. I like standardized tests, which is kind of weird, right? That's the kind of thing that I can only tell all of you. I'd lose all of my friends very quickly if I were just to say, hey, aren't they great? But I do like them. I do like the mechanics of how they work. I do like what they're testing. And I find that it's something that, I'm fairly proficient at. And because of this, I didn't know what I wanted to do, but I thought I wanted to go to business school. And, because you have to take the CAT, you have to take, the GMAT, and you got to, it was a field where I thought that, hey, I could succeed. But over time, I realized that, I don't really enjoy the idea of going to business school itself. I'm not looking to start my own business. I'm not looking to study so much about how businesses themselves function. What I liked was the test. And what I like even more than that is teaching stuff, is sharing insights, is, explaining things, is talking about the way that things work to people. And of course, that meant that, once I realized that I had to become a teacher, and that's where I'm at right now. So, one thing that I would say that comes through in my philosophy towards teaching is that you have to start by believing that you can beat the question. You have to start by believing that you have the tools available to you. Because to be very honest, the tools that you need in order to solve these questions are not very many. What it really is an innovative and creative application of those tools in order to get the results that you want. So if you start by believing that you do have the tools, you can always figure out the technique. You can always work through that with practice. And that is something that you'll see will come through in this session as well as in my general approach to teaching. When I'm not coaching the GMAT or the GRE, I really enjoy cricket and football. Particularly the statistical side and analysis of these sports. I really like hip hop, video games, and I'm the kind of nerd who, is very deep into history and politics and philosophy and, ideas around that general milieu of the world and how it works. So that's a little bit about myself. Let's dive into a bit about, Crack Verbal and what we do as an institution. Essentially, what we found is that, of course, you're here to prep for the GMAT, and that's, of course, a big part of what we do. That is an essential part of what we do. But what we've come to realize is that, the test is one thing, but for so many of you, and presuming that, you either live in India right now or that you are from, a third world country, or you're from a non-native English speaking country and looking to make the move to the first world, what happens is that the GMAT is a very important part, and because it's important, it's scary. And because it's scary, it occupies all of your time. But there's other steps to the process. In fact, you're going to be making a huge decision about where you want to live. I made this decision in my life, and after making it, I realized, hey, maybe I don't want to stay in Amsterdam where I did my master's. So it's a long process with a lot of steps, and what we've realized is that what we can really help with, what we can really bring our expertise to is sort of assisting you with this journey, assisting you with this process in a manner that goes beyond just taking the test, but the application process, what you're going to be thinking about when you move to a place, how to decide your unis when you move to a place, right? And essentially all of the other baggage that comes along with making such a big decision. So yes, GMAT is a big part of what we do, but it's also the entire process. In addition to this, I'd like to share with you a few free resources to get you started. So you can get on crackverbal.com. I think gmatonline.crackverbal.com gives you access to, our trial online course, and you can see how that works and how that's set up. Pretty useful, if I say so myself. We also have certain ebooks, which are, not very long books, right? We understand that the average attention span has certainly dropped quite a bit, but they are useful. They're effective nuggets of information that can give you a sense of, one concept or one specific idea about how to take on the GMAT effectively. Maybe, things about like, you may have done another standardized test. How is the GMAT different? How is it similar? How are you going to, overcome that challenge? In addition to this, I know that, reading a book takes some effort, right? And watching a video, that's something you can even have on in the background. So we have tons of videos available, with GMAT strategy, plenty of videos from Arun, our founder. You may already know Arun. In fact, probably already know Arun for sure. I'm the person who has to, introduce himself. And a lot of useful content, a lot of useful stuff that, I would categorize as both content that is going to directly, help you and you directly need in order to solve questions, as well as content that is a little bit more along the lines of useful knowledge about understanding the test as a whole, right? So a lot of useful content on YouTube, and YouTube is probably the easiest place to, get work done on the front that you're not doing very heavy level work. So yeah, always a nice resource to have. All right, so let's get started. And right before we get started, I just want to see if there's any questions that have come in at this point. Great, so no questions. Remember that you can ask your questions in on the Q&A tab. You can put a general chat, or you can put a question as well on the chat window, right? I encourage you to use these functions. At various points, I'll be stopping over and we'll have a discussion about whatever it is that you've put down in the chat. Okay, that being said, right, we've gotten all of the busy work and all of the little stuff to start with out of the way. Let's dive straight into what you're here for, which is the boldface questions themselves. So let's try and understand, first of all, what a boldface question is anyway, right? What do we mean when we say boldface question, right? Now, fortunately, the name itself is pretty telling. When we say boldface, what it means is that you're going to get an argument, and that argument is going to have two statements marked in bold. Great. What your task is to identify the relationship between the two sentences that are in bold. So there's going to be an argument. It's a long argument. It looks like a paragraph, and you're going to have two statements marked in bold. Your job is to identify what the relationship is between those statements, how those statements sort of play into the argument as a whole. At this point, you may see that, there's a poll that has been made available. I see that most of you have answered it. If you haven't, poll number 1 has been made available. Just go ahead and answer it, and we can get into a discussion about what the boldface question is and how to approach it. As you can see, the bottom half of the screen, or the bottom 2/3 of the screen, because these are long questions. The bottom 2/3 of the screen has this giant argument with options, right? And it is pretty long. I've had to shrink the font size a bit so that it would fit. So certainly long, difficult, challenging, Byzantine, confusing, right? All kinds of adjectives that would apply to boldface questions. You have this really long argument, and you have to pick apart just these two statements and what these statements do in terms of how they impact the argument as a whole. So fairly complex, right? Now, I want to bring up the poll that I made available to all of you. I'm going to end the polling now because it's been open for a while, and more than 80% of you answered it. So I think that's a good turnout. That's more than most countries have for their elections. So certainly we're on the up and up there, right? Let's take a look at what you all have said. Now, I see that the first thing is that about 15 to 17% of you, so like a sixth of you, have said that you have a strategy in mind. You know what your strategy is going into a boldface question, and you execute that strategy. Great. If you're already at that point, very, very good, fantastic, right? You may not even necessarily need all of the content that we're going to cover today. That being said, still could be useful, still could be stuff that is just new for you. The next option was I just dive in and trust my reasoning abilities, which, to be honest, is pretty common. You get a question like this, it's long, it's challenging. You don't think too much about it. You're like, hey, you know what? Let me just read what the options have to say. Let me see how I can go through it, right? I trust that I have some kind of logical ability. I'll try to solve the question like that. And that's almost a third of you who have said that. So makes sense, right? Fair enough. Another, actually more than a third of you, almost 40% of you have said, I tentatively try to eliminate options. So very similar to the previous option, but maybe a little bit less confidence, right? You don't necessarily feel confident, but there is no other approach. So you might as well take the first step. You might as well try to narrow down the field of opportunities, narrow down the field of possibilities, and then go ahead with something. And lastly, some of you have just straight up said, hey, I don't, like these questions are just too hard. These questions are a nightmare. You know what? I kind of sympathize with you. When I started out doing CR, when I started out doing critical reasoning, I thought, hey, these are just, okay, maybe they're not the worst questions in the world, but they are long, they are difficult, they are challenging. And, sometimes I just don't feel like I have the energy for them. And what I realized from this is that ultimately the problem is not that, you're in the last bracket. The problem is that this is such a different type of question to everything else that you automatically are going to be like, well, how do I solve it? There's no clear strategy. There's a sense of, hey, okay, maybe I eliminate stuff for one option first, one statement first, then the other. Sure, okay, that's a good plan, right? I won't say that's a bad plan. Sure, maybe I look at one statement, then consider what that statement's trying to tell. All of that's all very well and good. But the difference is that when you solve an SC question, you know what the rules of grammar are, and you know what you're looking to eliminate. When you solve an RC passage, you know what you're expected to do, even if the questions are difficult, and you certainly will get your fair share of difficult questions. Even the hardest questions have an approach. They have a pattern. They have, that you have to execute steps number 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Yeah, those are difficult to execute, but you know what you're doing. You know what you're going in trying to achieve. Whereas with the boldface question, the big problem is that, and as has been indicated by 90% of you, I don't know what I'm doing. I can solve the question. Maybe you can solve a fair few of the boldface questions, but you don't know what you're doing. And this is two problems, right? This creates two problems, really. The first is that, well, you could very well get a question wrong if your technique isn't right. Secondly, even if your technique ends up being right, or even if you end up getting to the right answer, because of the haphazard manner in which you've got there, you certainly would have taken a lot of time, and that can impact the amount of time that you have on the rest of the test, right? So let's take a look at this question here. We're not going to answer it just yet, but let's just see what it has to say so that you get a sense of, well, this is what you could expect to see, right? So this astronomer is saying that observations of the Shoemaker-Levy comet on its collision course with Jupiter showed that the comet broke into fragments before entering Jupiter's atmosphere in 1994, but they didn't show how big those fragments were. In hopes of gaining some indication of the fragments' size, astronomers studied spectrographic analyses of Jupiter's outer atmosphere. These analyses revealed unprecedented layers of sulfur after the fragment's entry. The fragments themselves almost certainly contain no sulfur, but many astronomers believe that the cloud layer below Jupiter's outer atmosphere does contain sulfur. Since sulfur would have seeped into the outer atmosphere if comet fragments had penetrated this cloud layer, it is likely that some of the fragments were at least large enough to have passed through Jupiter's outer atmosphere without being burned up. In the astronomer's argument, the two portions in boldface play which of the following roles? Great, so we have an argument given to us, and we have two statements. The first being the fragments themselves contain no sulfur, but the astronomers believe that the layer below Jupiter's outer atmosphere does contain sulfur. And the second statement being that it is likely that some of the fragments were at least large enough to have passed through Jupiter's outer atmosphere. Now, if you're like me, or I would say forget if you're like me or not, right? If you are trying to deal with these questions, and you're still early in your prep, a lot of what the argument says itself is confusing. Oh, they did spectrographic analyses, and what are we saying about the sulfur? What does it mean if there's sulfur? How does this impact the overall argument? Is what the scientist saying, or is what the astronomer saying, is it true or not? Does it make sense or not in the context? There's all of these thoughts that immediately flash by whenever you solve any reasoning-based question, because that's what most reasoning-based questions ask you to do, right? So it's quite natural to start thinking this way. But you know what? This is a pretty long question, right? You're going to have a lot to think about, and it's certainly going to take you like a minute and a half just to read and understand the question prompt and stem if you're trying to understand everything about a question. So you know what? What we're going to do is this. Let's take a step back, right? Let's step back for a second. Let's try and simplify what we're looking at, and let's think about what an argument is even composed of. What you've been told is that you're given this argument, and the argument is everything that this astronomer is saying from start to finish, right? Everything that the astronomer is saying, that's your argument. What is an argument anyway, though, right? You're given an argument for every CR question. What is an argument? What constitutes an argument? And what are we looking for within that, right? So let's try and break that down, right? Now, boldface questions can be categorized as structure-based CR questions. And I'd say that there are, sort of really three major categories: assumption-based, content-based, and structure-based. And we'll very briefly touch upon what those mean, but you'll have a sense of what I mean when I'm talking about these. What I do want to draw attention to is that when we say structure-based, what this means is that we're looking at the structure of an argument. We're looking at the building blocks that make up an argument, right? So we're looking at, if an argument is constructed a certain way, much like Lego blocks are, what we're looking at is how have those Lego blocks been put together, right? And that is a good analogy because it says that that's all we're looking at. That's all we want to focus on, right? An argument has many parts to it, but we're only going to look at the structure. So what do we see in an argument anyway? What are the different parts of an argument? What are we going to be presented with? Ultimately, I would say that there are three parts of an argument and there are four elements to an argument. And let's get into what that means. So if you look at the diagram, or you look at the graphic, I think graphic's a strong word for what's been put up there. But okay, if you look at the picture, let's say, it says premises plus assumptions equals conclusion. And this is every critical reasoning argument ever. This is all of the critical reasoning arguments out there. This is not specific to boldface questions. In fact, to some extent, you could argue that this is every argument. This is every argument in the whole world. This is how an argument is built, right? Arguments can come in all shapes and sizes, but fundamentally, these are the different types of building blocks used to put the argument together. These are the different Lego pieces used to construct whatever argument it is that you're trying to make. So what are these parts anyway? When we speak about premises, what are premises? Premises are simply the true facts that have been given to us, right? So if you're told something, if you're told, for example, that the effects of global warming have been increasing at an exponential level in the past 5 years. In order to deal with the fallout from climate change, it will be necessary to relocate millions of people around the world to places with higher ground. Now, the point that I was saying about the fact that global warming has caused greater impact, that's just a fact that you've been told in the argument. That's a fact, and you were given this fact in the scope, in the parameters, in the paradigm of the argument itself. From here on out, we'll call that a premise. You could call it a fact, you could call it a detail, you could call it evidence, you could call it a consideration, you could call it data, you could call it any one of these things. We're going to call it premises so that we're all on the same page, so that we're all thinking along the same lines, right? It's easier if we're using the same jargon to progress our ideas. The next part of an argument is the conclusion. The conclusion is essentially, you could call it the main point, you could call it the position, you could call it the argument itself, right? But essentially, if you want to break it down in layman's terms, what is the conclusion anyway? The conclusion is the thing that the author is trying to convince you of. So when you read the argument as a whole, what is the takeaway that you should have? What is it that the author wants? The author wants you to read this and then come away from it thinking, oh, okay, well, that the author was trying to tell me that. That's what I wanted. That's what I had to come away knowing. That thing is the conclusion. So if we take the example that I just, made on the fly, right? That climate change is, impacting us all, and it will be necessary, because of the rising sea levels, it will be necessary to relocate millions of people around the world. So the thing that I want to convince you of, when I tell you all of the things that I just said, right? When I say all of that as an argument, what I'm looking to convince you of is that we should relocate people. That is the decision that I'm trying, that is what, if you hear what I had to say, that is what I want you to take away going home, right? That would be the conclusion. Hey, we should relocate millions of people. We need to relocate millions of people, right? So the thing that the author wants to convince us of, the thing that the author is trying to prove or disprove, right? That is the conclusion of the argument. Great. The next part of the argument is the assumption, or are the assumptions. Well, what are the assumptions anyway, right? What is an assumption? An assumption is very similar to a premise. It's a fact, or it's a statement, or it's something which helps lead to the conclusion. However, the only difference between a premise and an assumption is that a premise is something that you have already been told. An assumption is something that you think is true, or that is true, but it's not been explicitly told. So for example, if we go to the argument that I just said, right, that the effects of global warming have become stronger in the past 5 years, as a result of this, we're going to see, vast rising sea levels. And this means that we need to be able to relocate millions of people. Now, what I've assumed in this argument is that one of the effects of climate change is rising sea levels, right? Nowhere did I say in the argument that whenever you see climate change, you will also see sea levels. I just said that because of climate change, the sea levels are going to go up, and this is going to be what's happening. I never made that connection that climate change causes sea levels to go up. It's just something that I took to be true, and I accepted to be true, and you all accepted it to be true as well if you bought my argument, if you accepted my argument, right? So the difference between a premise and an assumption is simply that a premise is what you have been actively told in the argument, and assumption is what you have not actively been told in the argument. It's something that still is true according to the person who made the conclusion, but it is something that is not actively said. So that's the third part. And it's the premises and the assumptions, facts that have been said plus facts that have been not said, that come together, or, facts is a strong word. Facts is probably not a word I should be using in the age of fake news. Things that are given to us as true, that have been given in the argument, things that we accept to be true that are not given to us in the argument. These set of things that we accept to be true, all of them together, come together to give us the conclusion, give us what should be the action, what should be the decision, what should be the thing that I want to convince you of as a result, right? So premises plus assumptions equals conclusion. Fairly straightforward. There is, however, a fourth element to the argument. So 3 parts to an argument: premises, assumptions, and conclusions. There's a fourth element, and that element is the validity of the argument as a whole. The logical validity. Okay, these are the parts that make up the argument. These are the Lego blocks that make the structure. But is that structure a building, or is it something else? That is the question that we're trying to ask. when we say validity, right? That, okay, you have a structure, you have premises, you have assumptions, they've come together, they've made a conclusion, all very well and good. But is that a correct conclusion or not? Does that conclusion make sense given what we've been told, right? That is what we're looking at when it comes to validity. Now, these are the 4 elements of the argument, right? Nice to call them elements because, 4 of them. But what you'll find is that while these 4 elements are the 4 possible elements of every given argument, ultimately, when it comes to the type of question that you're solving, or rather dependent on the type of question you're solving, you will need to consider either all 4 of these elements, or just 3 of these elements, or just 2 of these elements. All right. Now, at this point, I'm going to take a very, very brief break of like, a couple of minutes to take on the questions. Antivirus. I'm not using my computer here today, so that's a bit of a problem. I see somebody saying that the poll results have still come on screen. If the poll results, I've said stop sharing of the results. Are the poll results still on the screen? If they still are on the screen, press 1. If they're not on the screen anymore, press 2. All right, so I see some people saying polls are not on the screen anymore. Thanks a lot. Thanks. I think that's good enough information for me. So yeah, that's I think the only question that has come in. I just want to also check. Am I going too quickly, or are you able to follow me? All right. So if you're able to follow everything that I've said, and if you think that I'm going at an okay pace, type in 1. If you think that I'm going a little bit too quickly, type in 2. Just want to get a general sense of how things are progressing. Okay, great. So most of you are fine. And, I think that somebody even said that I'm going kind of slow. So that's good. I'm going slow for everyone's benefit. And one of the things about the GMAT is that, some of this stuff may seem very obvious. You may know what an argument is composed of already. The reason I want to come back to this is because of how it will inform the way you answer other questions. I think that it's always important to have a good foundation. It's always important to know your enemy, and that will help you be in a better position. Okay, so a few other questions, right? Is this the approach that we should consider for all CR questions, or only boldface? The specific approach that I'm talking about, or that I will cover in the session, is just for boldface questions. But the idea that every argument is comprised of premises, assumptions, conclusions, and validity is something that is part of every argument. Somebody has asked also to clarify validity again. So essentially what we're trying to say is the argument valid or not? Now, I'll give you a good example of where this is relevant. When we do a question which says, pick something that weakens the conclusion. So when we pick an assumption that weakens the conclusion, well, we're already given premises. We're told what the conclusion is, so we care about those 2 things. The answer options are going to be assumptions that weaken the conclusion, so we care about assumptions. And in this case, we are specifically trying to make the conclusion less valid than it currently is. We're trying to make the conclusion not correct. We're trying to make the conclusion weak. So we are ultimately impacting the validity of the argument as a whole. If we're looking to strengthen the conclusion, we're ultimately looking to strengthen the conclusion as a whole. We're looking to make the conclusion more valid than it was before. So ultimately, these are the 4 elements: the premises, the conclusions, the assumptions, and the validity. All right. So here's some good news now for you when it comes to boldface questions. Now, in assumption-based questions, and by the way, I see some questions are still coming in from your end. A few minutes later, we'll pause, and if your question's still not been answered, we'll get to that. Now, in assumption-based questions, and assumption-based questions I would categorize as ones that say find the assumption, ones that ask you to strengthen the conclusion, ones that ask you to weaken the conclusion, and ones that ask you to evaluate the conclusion. So all of these are questions in which the answers are assumptions and they impact the argument. Now, with all assumption-based questions, you need to care about all 4 of the elements, right? You need to care about the premises because the premises are given to you and they impact the conclusion. You need to care about the conclusion because that is what you're looking to address and affect. You care about the assumptions because the assumptions are all in the answer options. And you care about the validity because, like I said, if it's a weaken question, you're looking to make the argument less valid. If it's an evaluate question, you're looking to find a statement that can tell me if the argument is more valid or less valid. So you have to care about validity. You care about all four parts. The premises and assumptions come together to make the conclusion, right? And we're always looking to make an argument either more valid or less valid or both with evaluate. Now, that's one type of question. When you move on to content-based questions, which are the second category of CR question, which are essentially inference-based questions or paradox-based questions, we still care about the premises because the premises are given to us in the stimulus. We still care about the conclusion because in a paradox question, the conclusion is paradoxical. The conclusion kind of doesn't make sense. And in an inference question, we are the ones giving a conclusion. We are the ones inferring what we already know. So we do care about the conclusion. And we're looking to help the validity of the argument as well. Because in an inference question, we care about giving an inference that is valid. We care about making an argument that is completely valid. With a paradox question, the argument appears invalid. We're looking to make the argument valid again, right? So ultimately, we do care about the premises. We do care about the conclusion. We do care about the overall validity of the argument. But what we don't care about anymore are the underlying assumptions. So let's strike out assumptions. Now, that's the content. Those are the content-based CR questions, and we've looked at assumptions and content. When we now come to structure-based CR questions, like the boldface questions, it gets even better because we need to care about the premises, right? We need to care about, because the premises are given to us in the argument. We need to care about the conclusion because the conclusion is given to us in the argument. But what is the question? The question is, what are the statements in bold doing? What is the relationship of the statements in bold? Do we care whether the argument is a good argument or a bad argument? Absolutely not. We don't give one jot whether the argument is good or bad. It could be the most messed up, incorrect argument in the whole world, but all we are looking at is the two boldface statements and the relationship between them. So once again, we don't even care about the validity of the argument. So all of that stuff about, is it possible that the sulfur from the comet, that the sulfur, was there in the comets or not, or whether the sulfur was there in the atmosphere or not. Do we want to say whether that actually is true or not? Do we want to say whether the astronomer is right or not? No, we don't give a shit what the astronomer thinks, right? What the astronomer thinks is what she thinks. We just have to care about the statements given to us. So ultimately, we only have to care about the premises and the conclusion, right? I see some questions have come in, so I'll take them quickly and then we'll move forward. Someone has said that, you come across words like positions, findings, data set, claim. Good point. We will get to that. Difference in find the assumption or strengthen and weaken questions. It's a little bit off topic, but when you're being asked to find the assumption, you're essentially being asked about what assumption makes the argument the way that it is. When you're doing strengthen or weaken, you're simply looking to make the argument more valid or looking to make the argument less valid. Somebody has also asked about, what if someone has no knowledge about the sector domain the argument is taken from? How can one make assumptions to the argument? If someone is not acquainted with global warming, how can they make assumptions on their own? Good point. And if you get questions on if you get boldface questions regarding this, right? And that's often the kind of boldface question that you'll get, about things that you may not be familiar about. Good point, right? You don't have to make assumptions. In fact, the whole purpose of bringing up the different parts of an argument is to let you know that, look, when we make arguments in our day-to-day lives, we make assumptions about things, right? We do make assumptions. Even if you don't know anything about global warming, you may still make some assumptions about it based on the very minimal information that you know. But when it comes to boldface questions for the CR, we can move forward to say, hey, look, we don't have to make any assumptions whatsoever. We don't care about assumptions. We don't care about validity. Somebody's asked about the crack verbal course is online and whether the official guides are enough for a GMAT 750 score. That's a more complicated question, and that's not something that I could necessarily get into, over this. I would say that that ultimately, theoretically, yes. Theoretically, yes. But in practice, you're going to find that there's all other kinds of obstacles, including the obstacles of where you're currently at and how you might think about taking on the test. So, that's theoretically, I would say yes, but that's not something that you could say definitively, hey, yeah, this is all enough. All right. Let me see. Do I see anything else coming in on the chat? Is there a book to practice advanced English? I would say yes, and if you look up stuff on Amazon, you will find stuff like this, but I would say it is not particularly helpful, at least for the purposes of doing well on the GMAT. If you're looking to get better at English in general, absolutely, sure, go for it, but not for the GMAT, right? And I don't think that's something that you definitively need in order to get to this point. But all right, let's come back to the point that we were making, right? Ultimately, all we need to care about are the premises and conclusions. And if we go back to the parts of an argument, right? We said premises, assumptions, conclusion. We don't care about validity, so let's pretend that that's not a thing anymore. Like I said, premises, facts that we see, assumptions, facts that we don't see, conclusion, of course, we see the conclusion because that's what the author is trying to convince us of. So really, we see this, we don't see the assumptions. So that means that when you look at a boldface question, you can only deal with what you see. You can't deal with what you don't see. As somebody pointed out, if you don't have any knowledge, how can you make assumptions? So you only deal with premises and conclusions. And what I would go even further to say is that every single statement in a CR question, and particularly in boldface questions, is either a premise or a conclusion. It cannot be an assumption because an assumption is not stated, and it cannot be anything about the validity. Ultimately, every statement is a premise or a conclusion, right? So straight away, you can bifurcate all statements that you see into premises or conclusions. And now let's try that out. Let's take a look at, a boldface, the stimulus for a boldface question here. And let me get rid of the annotation that I made at the bottom. Great. So let's take a look at this question over here. In every CR argument, there are just premises and conclusions. And as you can see, there are two statements in black. Those are the two bolded statements. So students who do well on the GMAT typically drink Red Bull during the break. There are a lot of students who have done well while taking Red Bull. However, recent studies have shown that taking Red Bull can actually be bad for concentration, and that the students who took Red Bull and scored high could have scored higher if they had not taken it. Hence, it is incorrect to believe that Red Bull can help your performance on the GMAT. All right. Now, firstly, what is the conclusion, right? Let's start by trying to identify, well, what is the conclusion? What is the thing that the author is trying to convince me of, right? So what does she want to convince me of here? What is the takeaway that I should get from here? The takeaway that I should get from here is that it is incorrect to believe that Red Bull can help my performance. What she's really trying to drive home to me, what she really wants me to understand as a result of, what she said in this statement is that, I should probably not take Red Bull, or rather that Red Bull will not help me for the GMAT, right? That's the overall takeaway. So this statement, hence, it is incorrect to believe that Red Bull can help your performance on the GMAT, is the conclusion. Great. So let's mark that down as a conclusion. You know what? Let's get the annotations out again. And I'm going to call this bold 2. So bold 2, we now know to be the conclusion in the argument. Let's take a look at all of the other statements. Students who do well on the GMAT typically drink Red Bull during the break. Okay, that's just a fact, right? That's just data that we've been given. That's just an observation. There's no reasoning required there, right? So let's put bold 1 on this side. Bold. Apologize for my handwriting, but what can you do? Okay, so bold 1 on one side, bold 2 on the other. Let's take a look at the next statement. There are a lot of students who have done well while taking Red Bull. This too is, just a statement. There's no reasoning being used here. So this too is a premise, right? So this is the blue one. So let's go with blue is also a premise. Okay. However, recent studies have shown that taking Red Bull can actually be bad for concentration. Now, whenever they talk about a recent study and the findings of a recent study, that too is just data. That too is a data point. So you could say that studies show that that Red Bull affects concentration. The conclusion, which requires reasoning, would be that you should not take Red Bull. The conclusion is always a decision. The data, the observations, the findings are always going to be premises. So let's, call that what? Brown, beige. I'm just going to put a BR and say that, for brown, and say that the brown statement is also a premise. Great. The next statement, and the students who took Red Bull and scored high could have scored higher if they had not taken it. Again, this is just a finding. This is something that the recent study has shown us. So therefore, this statement is in pink. So let's put pink as well on this side. And we can say that ultimately, all four other statements were premises, and there was just one conclusion in this argument. Now, in boldface questions, you can sometimes have two conclusions. So I would not just say, hey, look, there's one conclusion, great, we found it, everything else is a premise. But the point being that every statement in this question can either be categorized as a premise or a conclusion. Every single statement, bar none. And this is super helpful. This is going to be the foundation that you're going to use to solve all boldface questions. You know now that every statement can only be put into one of these two categories. Either it's on the premise side of things or it's on the conclusion side of things, right? Makes your life a whole lot easier. Now, if you look at the diagram that I have put in place here, what you'll see is that there are four parts, right? It's in quadrants rather than just in halves. And as you can see, it says premise support, premise against, conclusion main, conclusion other. Now, let's try and see what else we can use to help us identify what a statement is. We've gone into saying that their premises or their conclusions, fantastic, straightforward, obvious, good. Now, once we know that a statement is a premise, what types of premises really are there? There are premises that help support the overall conclusion. There could be premises that don't support the overall conclusion as well. There could be premises that support a different conclusion, or there could just be premises that go against the main conclusion. So now we have, right, premises that support or premises that go against. So now we can split it on another dimension, right? So now we've identified that once they're premises, they can be premises that support or premises that go against. The similar thing can be done for the conclusion. You can have the conclusion being the conclusion that supports, which really is the main conclusion, right? Because the conclusions aren't supporting anything. The conclusions are the conclusions themselves. So you have the main conclusion, or you have a different conclusion. It's a conclusion that goes against the main conclusion. It's a conclusion that is separate to the main conclusion. It may not be the opposite of the main conclusion, but if you've drawn conclusion A, and then you go ahead and draw conclusion B, even if A and B are similar, there's still at least something that they disagree on. Otherwise, why draw a different conclusion to begin with? So therefore, against is a little bit much, but let's say conclusion other. Now, let's put these statements back on. So the second boldface statement, hence it is incorrect to believe that Red Bull can help your performance. This is what the author is trying to convince me of. So this would go into the main conclusion. Students who have done well on the GMAT typically drink Red Bull during the break. This is talking about students drinking Red Bull and doing well. But what the author wants to convince us of is that you shouldn't take Red Bull for the GMAT. So that means that boldface statement 1 is actually a statement that is a premise, but it goes against the conclusion. That would be bold 1. Let's just put bold 2 over here, because why not? Right? So bold 1 is a premise, but it goes against the conclusion. What about the blue statement? There are a lot of students who have done well while taking Red Bull. Okay, now this too is a premise, this too is a fact, but ultimately it doesn't support the conclusion, right? This is also something that goes against what the conclusion is trying to tell us, that, hey, you shouldn't take Red Bull. So let's put the blue statement in premise against as well. However, recent studies have shown that Red Bull can be bad for concentration. This too is a premise, but this supports the conclusion. If we take this, this leads us to the direction that, hey, we should, not really take Red Bull at all. So this brown one, let's put under premise and support. And the last statement, students who took Red Bull and scored high could have scored higher if they had not taken it, right? This too, right? The pink statement, also a premise, and it ultimately is leading you to the idea that you should not take Red Bull. So this means then, I should probably say that's pink, so PI. Ultimately, you have statements that were premises that supported, you have statements that were premises that went against, you have a statement that was the main conclusion, and in some cases, you can have a statement that is a conclusion, but not the main conclusion of the argument, some other conclusion. But every single statement that you see in a boldface question can be put in one of these 4 quadrants. Every single statement, I guarantee you this, right? No matter what statement you see. In this question, there are only two boldface statements, right? The first one is a premise that goes against. The second one is the main conclusion of the argument. Okay, great. But I showed you how you can do it for every other statement as well, and you absolutely can. The reason I want to point this out to you is that this is not just a technique that works in the moment or in the zone. This is a fundamental way to understand how an argument is set up. And based on this, you can really look at every argument along the same lines. You have premises that back up your main conclusion. You have premises that go against your main conclusion. You have your main conclusion itself. And you have conclusions that are not your main conclusion. Conclusions that don't support what your main conclusion is trying to tell you as a whole. All right, let's take a look at the questions that have come in. So, let's see. So you mean to say that where I stand in the 750 score, the difference will be eliminated by practice and these things that I've mentioned above. See, you can, but maybe it doesn't happen as well. I would say that you cannot get fixated on setting a target score and sorry, I don't think that everyone can see the questions that have come up. So this is from Ankur, right? Who also asked about 750 before. See, practice is one thing, but it has to be the right kind of practice, right? You can do 100 boldface questions and not get better at them. Or you can understand what is the foundation of how a boldface question is set up, and then it'll get a whole lot easier, right? And the same thing is, is something that can be followed all across the board. Varun asks, is the pink statement not an assumption? Now, we can't say that the pink statement is an assumption because like we saw as, the definitions of an assumption and a premise, at least the definitions that we're using for the purposes of CR, right? The pink statement is given to us in the argument. An assumption is by definition unstated. If we had not been told this and this was something that you thought to be true, then it would be an assumption. But we have been given it and it's not a conclusion, hence it is a premise. In fact, that is the point that we're trying to drive home, that every statement here is a premise or a conclusion. Because it has been given to us, it has to be in one of these categories. An assumption is not given to us. The validity is not told to us. What is given is always premises and conclusion. Somebody has also asked, an anonymous attendee, what would have been a conclusion or, conclusion other? What could have been something that falls into this quadrant? If they had said somewhere that, based on this, some testing center has recommended that students carry Red Bull to the center. So that would be a recommendation. That would be a reasoning. That would be a decision, a position that has been taken up, right? It's telling you what to do on the basis of the information. Students who do well on the GMAT typically drink Red Bull. A lot of students have done well while taking Red Bull. Hence, a testing center has recommended that students take Red Bull to the test center. However, recent studies have shown so and so and so. So that recommendation would be a conclusion that would go against the main conclusion, right? So it's a conclusion mentioned, but it's not the main one. Now that you have a sense of this, right, it could seem like it's very easy, right? Hey, This is all there is to it. Every statement goes into one of these 4 categories. Piece of cake, right? I think that this question was not particularly hard to identify what these statements were. But there are some things that could be challenges. I do see some, some other questions. Will you share the video session with us? This will be made available on YouTube. So I don't think you'll get a direct link to it, but you can check our channel. You may get a direct link to it. Actually, I'm not so sure how things work on the support side of the equation. So probably a good idea to ask about it, maybe. But it'll certainly be available on YouTube. Like it'll absolutely be accessible on YouTube at another point. All right, so let's move on, right? I think at this stage, we've broken everything down. Very straightforward. Everything is in one of these 4 categories. So why are boldface questions hard anyway, right? Why do they seem confusing? Why do they seem like a bit of a challenge? Really, there are 2 challenges to boldface questions, and they go as follows, right? So let's take a look at them. So trap number 1, right? Challenge number 1. The answer choices use phrases or words that make it sound confusing. Somebody had said before that, when I solve boldface questions, I find words like positions, findings, data set, claim. You're right. Those are complicated words and they do come up in the answer options, right? We know premises and conclusion. The option may not give us premises and conclusion. So we have to do some translation over there. The second trap is that the actual conclusion or the point of the author is sometimes hidden by the presence of other conclusions. Sometimes, like when I said some testing centers have recommended to take Red Bull, that's quite obviously a conclusion that is not the main conclusion. That's quite obviously some other conclusion. Sometimes the question can be worded in a manner that makes it hard to try and understand what is the author trying to convince me of anyway? What does the author want to push forward to me as a concept for me to understand? So let's take a look at how these traps end up functioning in a little bit more detail before we get to how to handle these traps as a whole. Now, the Red Bull question, very straightforward, right? We saw that the first statement was a premise that went against. Second statement was conclusion main. First statement, premise against. Second statement, conclusion main. Fantastic. Let's look at the correct answer to the question. It goes, the first is a premise presented to support a position against an argument that is supported by the author. The second presents an objection to that position. And yeah, what are they saying here, right? What is that even trying to tell me, right? And that's true. The options are worded in a manner that is designed to be very frank, to screw with you, right? The options are set up to screw with you. The options are set up in a manner, they're worded in such a manner to get you thinking, well, what the hell did this guy even just say? What am I being asked, right? But the good news is this. The way that an option is worded, while it might be confusing, it cannot be open to interpretation. It cannot be the case that, hey, if I interpret a question this way, I could come to answer option A. If I interpret this word this way, I could come to answer option B. You cannot have a question like that because of the adaptive nature of the GMAT. If they make a wrong question like that, you can sue them, right? Because it will impact how the rest of the test goes and you've paid money for their service. So they have to, although they can ask questions with confusing wording, the wording must still be wording that can ultimately translate to something or the other. It must ultimately still be something that you can, bring it down to premise against, or you can bring it down to conclusion main. So let's try and take this question, take this option and break it down into those 4 quadrants, see if it matches the quadrants that we were talking about, right? We had premise against, conclusion main. So let's see whether this matches that or not. The first is a premise. Okay, good start. Presented to support a position. Now let's think about that for a second. Every premise is presented to support some position or the other, right? Every premise is going to, maybe it doesn't support the position of the argument, maybe it supports the other position, but it supports a position. Every premise supports a position. So that's just word salad. That's just giving you words to mess with you. Let's pretend that those words don't exist. Let's just read on so that we can break this down. So the first is a premise against an argument supported by the author. Great. So that tells us exactly what we wanted, right? The first is a premise against the argument. There we go. Premise against. Fantastic. The second presents an objection to that position. Okay, so when we say that position, now we have to come back to the first position, right? So objection to that position. We know that the position here is against the author. The objection to that position would be for the author. The objection to that position would be the author's argument. The objection to that position would be the author's main argument, or as we classified it, the objection to the position would be the main conclusion. So ultimately what you have to do is this, right? You identify what quadrant the statement goes into, but you also have to identify what quadrant is being described by the option itself, right? The first is a premise, okay, great, presented to support a position, whatever. The first is a premise against the argument of the author. Good, premise against. The second is an objection to that position. So the second is the objection to the position against the author. So the second is the author's position. Enemy of my enemy is my friend. So therefore, statement 1 works, statement 2 works, and this answer makes a lot of sense. So really, the challenge comes from reading the wording of the answer and also categorizing the answer into those quadrants. Every statement is in those quadrants, but you got to put the answer in those quadrants as well. All right, I'm going to take some questions now for 5 minutes, and then we'll move on to the second challenge. All right. So somebody's asked about how to decode words like proposal, argument, opinion, idea, given with the answer choices. How do we distinguish between these choices? That's a good question. Now, what will happen is that you will get better at this with practice. But now that you know that you've seen one question like this, okay, premise, good. Support a position. Now, what we have is a sense that every premise is supporting a position. Every conclusion is supported. So when they say that that the first is a statement presented to support a position, you know that that's a premise. Because premises do the supporting, premises support a conclusion. So that means premises do the supporting, conclusions are supported, right? A proposal is a suggestion to do something. So if it's a suggestion to take action, that would be a conclusion. Argument, that would be a conclusion. Opinion, that is somebody's view of something. So that would be a conclusion. Idea, main idea, that would be somebody's view, somebody's approach to something, that would be a conclusion, right? This is something that you will get better with practice. But the good news is that you know that it works like a code now, right? It works just like learning any computer language. When you see support a position and once that has been described as a premise, now you know that whenever you see support a position, that's about a premise. When you see argument in some place and you see that that's being used to talk about a conclusion, you now know that whenever they talk about argument, that you can substitute the word argument for conclusion. Similarly for this question, right? The second presents an objection. Now I know that an objection goes against a position. So that means an objection is against the conclusion. So that means an objection has to be a conclusion as well, because you can only have a conclusion that goes against another conclusion. You have an objection, something that rejects the conclusion. So that would be a conclusion itself. So now I know all throughout that whenever I see objection, objection means conclusion. Somebody has asked, are boldface questions usually 700 plus questions? Not all of them, but they tend to be harder than the average question, simply because it's difficult to come up with good boldface questions. So they generally tend to be the challenging ones that stick around. So I would not recommend saying, hey, I saw a boldface question. That means it was probably a hard one. But on average, they're slightly harder. How can we say that something is a position or it's a claim? So I would say this, right? Both a position and a claim. A claim is something that the author is saying to be true, right? When you claim something, you're saying that something is true. So a claim would also be the same thing as a position. Fundamentally, in practice, right, there's no difference between position and claim. Ultimately, when you see these words, all you have to do is break it down to, well, position is conclusion, claim is conclusion, right? And ultimately, that is what will help on that front. Now, let's see, there's some other questions that have come in on the Q&A, so I'll ask those. Or rather, not ask those, answer those. Okay. Am I available for doubt clearing for online crack verbal students? Yes, if you, what I recommend is that you send any queries that you have to prep@crackverbal. right? And that goes for all of you. If you're students, if you are students, you can send in queries to prep@crackverbal. If you're not a student, I believe it doesn't go through. So, I mean, the mail goes through, but there's some other setup that we have. I'm not really sure how it works, but yeah. Keywords like hence, therefore are used to indicate conclusions in the argument, or this is not always the case? That's a good question, Sparsh. Yeah, if you see words like hence or therefore, that kind of tells you that what's about to come is a conclusion, right? And that's essentially what you're trying to get at. As you move forward, as you practice more questions, you will be able to build a list of this yourself, right? You will be able to say, oh, hey, I see that they've used the word hence, and after that, I always see a conclusion. That means that hence means conclusion, right? And that is what you build over time. That is what you understand over time. But good point. Yes, if you see words like hence and therefore, they would be used to indicate conclusions. How can we say whether something is a position or a claim? That's already been answered. So let's move on at this point. So we've looked at one challenge, right? One challenge is the tricky answer wording. But as you can see, it may look tricky, but it's formulaic. The GMAT has set it up in a formulaic manner. When they use the word data, they know that data is findings. Findings are observations. Observations are facts. Facts are just the premises. So when they use data, they know that they're talking about premises. They're also thinking along those lines. So you want to think the same way the GMAT thinks. And then when you see those words, of course, this comes with practice, but you can take them down every time you do a question. You can see, oh, that's what that word meant. From here on out, I know that data is always going to be a premise. I know that observations are always going to be a premise. I know that objections are always going to be a conclusion, right? And that's something that you can pick up on. Remember, though, that it is formulaic. So you can break it down like it's a formula. You don't have to try and understand, oh, what is the meaning of this thing as a whole? No, break it down to premise, support, premise against, conclusion main, conclusion other. Break it down into into those quadrants, and you're good to go. All right. The second challenge, as we said, is that the main conclusion can be somewhat obscured. Now, in this argument, right, I want you to read this argument. So I'm going to give you, I'm going to give you 2 minutes in order to read this argument as a whole. And I have 2 questions of you. Not what is the intermediate conclusion, what is the main conclusion. Let's actually let's change that a bit. Loaner laptop really isn't very helpful, but okay. How many conclusions are there? All right, and let's change the second one as well to where are they located? All right. Bad formatting aside, I'm just going to take 2 minutes and well then, put your answers on the chat. Put your answers on the chat. If you think that you have an answer for it, go ahead and put it on the chat. By the way, somebody's asked, what's the difference between an intermediary conclusion and a main conclusion? So a simpler way to think about it is don't use the word intermediary. I think that is more confusing than it needs to be. Think about the main conclusion as the main thing that the author, or if they tell you somebody in the argument and they ask about that person's conclusion, the main thing that they are trying to convince you of is the main conclusion. Any other conclusion is an intermediary conclusion. Any other conclusion is an other conclusion. So how many conclusions are there, right? Answer that when you can. And where are the conclusions located? That could be a little bit more complex to type on the chat, but if you want to take a shot at it, go ahead, right? It's now 8:40, just became 8:41, but you've had some time to look at it. Once it becomes 8:42, I will discuss the answers to these 2 questions. now that you've had some time to take a look at, what's being presented here, we can say, we can actually answer these questions. Now, a bunch of you have said 2 conclusions. A couple of you have said 3 conclusions. All right, so 2 and 3, that's the toss-up. Are there 2? Are there 3? Interesting. All right, now I can settle it here. The right answer is that there are 2 conclusions. All right, let's try and do what we just did, right, with breaking down statements into premises or conclusions and see what it says. In countries where health insurance includes compensation for allergic reactions to prescribed medicines, reports of having suffered such allergies are twice as frequent as they are in countries where allergic reaction is not required, is not covered. Okay, so that's just reports, right? This is just telling us the data that, this is what happens in these countries, this is what happens in those countries. So let's say that this first statement is a premise, and you know what? P for premise, P for purple. So I'm going to change this to purple, right? And we'll put conclusions in, I don't know, a color with C. So let's just, we'll figure something out. Some analysts have argued correctly that since there's presently no conclusive test for medical allergy, bogus reports of medical allergies cannot be easily identified. So there's no conclusive test, and as a result of that, medical allergies cannot be easily identified. Now, they're not telling us that this is not really a conclusion in itself. It's just telling us that, well, we cannot identify allergy. We cannot identify whether somebody has an allergy or not, right? Or we cannot actually identify if somebody's just making it up or not, right? That's also now a true fact. So we can go ahead and say that that too is a premise. Great. I hope that color is not too bright. All right. These analysts are, however, wrong to draw the further conclusion. Wait a second, what is the conclusion that they have drawn? What is the conclusion that the analysts have drawn? But we know now that they're wrong to draw the further conclusion, okay? That in countries with the higher rates of reported allergic reactions, half the reported cases are bogus. There we go. Now, this statement is a little bit complicated because it tells us something about what the analyst's conclusion is. So what is the analyst's conclusion? The analyst's conclusion is that half the reported cases are bogus, right? We know that the premise is that we cannot identify bogus reports. We know that there is no test. The conclusion that they have drawn from it is half the reported cases are bogus. So now let's pick a color. You know what? I'm going to abandon the looking for a color with C altogether because my knowledge of colors with C is very minimal. And I'm just going to go ahead and mark this as red. So we now know the analyst's conclusion, half the reported cases are bogus. We're also being told, though, that these analysts are wrong to draw the further conclusion that half the reported cases are bogus. So one conclusion is that half the reported cases are bogus. Another conclusion is that these analysts are wrong. Right? So that too is a conclusion. So the analysts are saying, look, from the data that we found, the conclusion is that half the reported cases are bogus. The author is saying, wait a second, all of those facts are fine. All of those facts are well and good, but you came to the wrong conclusion. You didn't arrive at the right conclusion. So there is another conclusion here. Let's mark that not as dark red, but let's mark it as dark yellow, or rather golden. So 2 conclusions here. These analysts, the conclusion of the analyst is that half the reported cases are bogus. The conclusion of the author is that the analysts are wrong. So 2 conclusions contained in a single sentence. That's a problem, right? That can be sometimes a bit hard. But let's move on to the last statement. Clearly, in countries where health insurance does not include compensation for allergic reaction, people have little incentive to report medical allergies. So this is the basis of the author's conclusion, right? The fact that people don't have incentive to report allergy, that's just a fact. So that would just be a premise in itself. And it supports the conclusion that the analysts are wrong. There we go. This statement would be another premise, right? So let's come back to P for purple, P for premise. So really, we have all of these other statements as premises. There was just one sentence in which both the conclusions were contained. That one being what the analyst's conclusion was, the other being the author saying that the analysts are wrong. If you read this argument as a whole, right? Imagine if you weren't reading this in CR. Imagine if you were reading this as just, reading this as a regular person, right? Or imagine if somebody were telling you this. What is it that they are trying to convince you of? What they're trying to convince you of is that analysts have an idea about allergies and that the analysts are not correct. So the main conclusion, the main idea that the author is trying to put forward to you is that the analysts are wrong. So we can now say that this goal statement is conclusion main. We can say that half the reported cases are bogus, or rather, in the countries in which so and so, half the reported cases are bogus, right? So that would be the conclusion against. And the other statements are premises. Now, if the premise supports the fact that the analysts are wrong, it would be premise support. If it supports that half the reported cases are bogus, or that a lot of allergies are bogus, it would be premise against. So reports of having suffered such allergies are twice as frequent, right? So the fact that people give many more reports of allergies. This would support the analysts. This does not support us. So let's keep that as purple. That's premise against. Some analysts have argued correctly. So now we've been told argue. That might suggest that it's a conclusion. Some of you said there are 3 conclusions in here, and I'm guessing that you probably thought that this was a conclusion. But here's the thing. We've been told some analysts have argued correctly. So if we've already been told that the conclusion is correct, it stops being a conclusion and it starts just becoming a premise. A conclusion is something that the author wants to convince you of. This means that as of now, you're not convinced of it, or as of now, the information is not complete on it. The moment, so for example, I could conclude if I were debating somebody who believes that the earth is flat. And by the way, there are people who believe the earth is flat, right? Nuts. But they do, right? Now, if I were debating this person, I could say, but we have had flights that have literally gone around the planet. And based on that, my conclusion is that the earth must be round, right? And in that case, that's something that I would have to say as a conclusion. But if I'm talking to somebody about something else altogether, right? The earth is round and, the moon doesn't have its own light. Therefore, it makes sense that the curvature of the shadow on the moon comes from the earth. Now, in that case, I've used the earth is round as a premise, right? Why? Because in that argument, we've already accepted that the earth is round. There's nothing up for debate. There's nothing to convince on that front. So when we say some analysts have argued correctly, this statement also becomes a premise. This becomes something that the analysts have correctly identified to be true. This statement too, right, that we cannot identify the bogus reports, supports the analyst. So let's keep that in purple. The last statement, on the other hand, says that people have little incentive to report medical allergies. People don't have an incentive to say, hey, should I, if I have an allergy, I should go and claim it or anything, because there's no point in doing so. They'll have to pay a lot of money. So this statement actually supports the main conclusion. So let's pick yellow, right? If we went with, yellow is ugly as hell. Let's pick something better than yellow. Let's go with blue. How about blue? Okay. All right. So now this statement supports the conclusion. So now if we have to go back to our diagram, if we have to go back to, fitting everything into, premise, conclusion, and, for or against or support against, let's put that in, right? So this is premise, support, premise, against, conclusion, main, and conclusion, other. So we have to put these statements in. The stuff that is in purple is, let's just undo that. The stuff that is in purple is just premises against. The stuff that is in brown or gold or, I just have yellow here, is the conclusion. Oh, wow, you can't see that at all. You know what? I'm going to switch that up to an orange. That's the conclusion main. The red one, right, is the conclusion against. It's the other conclusion. And the blue one, the light blue one, is the premises that support. Ultimately, once again, right, this is a difficult question to identify the main conclusion for. But once we did that, every statement can be categorized. Every statement can be put into this framework. So what was the challenge really? The challenge was identifying the conclusion, right? And you have to correctly identify the main conclusion, because when we say that premise support or premise against, how do you decide whether something is premise support or premise against? When we say supports, every premise supports a conclusion. When we say premise support, we're saying premise supports the main conclusion. So that's why it goes in PS. When we say premise against, it's a premise that goes against the main conclusion. That's why we say PA, right? This only therefore makes sense if we can identify the main conclusion of the argument. How best to do that, right? Ultimately, what you want to do is you want to think of this not as a CR question or as a CR argument. You want to think, hey, somebody's telling me this. Somebody's saying this to me. Somebody's trying to convince me of something. What are they trying to convince me of? What is the takeaway that they want for me to have? Once that is established, you're good to go. Once that is established, you can categorize every statement very easily. And really, these are the only two challenges. All you need to do is correctly identify the conclusion. And when you're looking at the options, you need to correctly categorize the statements or make sure the statements work. So what if we had to boil all of the information that we just discussed, right? All of that is there. Yes, good, makes sense. You have a sense of how boldface questions work. You understand the philosophy behind it. You understand, what it is that is the challenge and how to overcome it. All very well and good. But ultimately, boldface questions still take a bloody long time, right? It's a long question. It requires a lot of reading. You have to get through it somehow or the other, right? How do you minimize that? You minimize it by making it paint by numbers. You minimize it by saying, hey, I just need to execute steps 1 to 4 and therefore then I can solve the question. So what are those steps? 1, identify the main conclusion of the argument. Read the entire argument. First, pick apart what is the main conclusion, because every statement is in relationship to that main conclusion, right? So that's step number 1. Step number 2, pick the boldface statement that you think will be easier to identify, right? So when you see the 2 boldface statements, sometimes what you'll find is that you can do the first one first, second one second. No problem with that whatsoever. But you don't have to do first one first, second one second. You might find that the second statement is very obviously the main conclusion. Remember the Red Bull question? The second statement was so obviously the main conclusion. I think that I would start by looking at that statement first. For that statement, vertically scan the options. So look at A. A says second statement says so and so and so. B says second statement says so and so and so. Eliminate the options that don't match the meaning, right? Eliminate the options that don't fit into the same quadrant. Once you do this, you will automatically come down to just having 2 or 3 options left. For the other statement, now repeat the same process, right? Identify the quadrant of the other statement, and then look at the options and see whether the option is describing that quadrant or not. So identify the conclusion, start with the statement you think is easier, see which options work for that statement, and then see which options work for the other statement. Keep eliminating. You want to go by eliminating it by statement rather than option by option, for the simple reason that, let's say you take a look at option A, statement 1 works, statement 2 doesn't work. Well, can option B be the right answer? No, it can't, because statement 2 doesn't work. So the moment you see an option for which one statement also doesn't work, why bother reading the other one, right? So you're better off scanning vertically. You're better off picking a statement and looking at all of the options for that statement. Then picking the next statement, looking at all of the options for that statement. And that is ultimately the entire composite strategy that you want to solve, that you want to take when it comes to boldface questions. Please put in any questions that you have on the chat now, because we will end this session by trying to solve a few questions ourselves. The first statement, somebody said the first statement seems to be a fact, just a fact and not against the conclusion. Okay, so reports are twice as so. I kind of agree with you. I'd say that it's not outright supporting the analyst. It's not outright going against the conclusion. If you have to, but I would, and what I would say is this, right? Ultimately, if you have to categorize, what do you think, if I am told that the reports are twice as frequent, if somebody tells you the statement, the fact that they have told you the statement already means that they're going to go along certain lines, right? Like the fact that, if I start talking to you about how men commit 99% of all terrorist acts, right? You know that I'm probably going to try and justify something to you along the lines of maybe, we need to do something about toxic masculinity, or we need to do something about the way that we raise men in society, right? Just because I started with that, right? So this statement, you're right, it doesn't actively support it. But you want to think about, well, if somebody was telling me this, why are they telling me this, right? And ultimately, they're telling me this, the person who's telling me this would be telling me this as grounds for why the analysts think the way that they do. Even though the author doesn't agree with the conclusion that comes out of this, this statement still supports what the analysts have to say. This still is being used to set up what the analysts have to tell us, right? The statements that end up being marked in bold tend to be more obvious. The point, however, that I wanted to make is that you can do it no matter what the statement is. That this is something that is ultimately an effective way of understanding any argument, no matter what. Let me see what has come in on the Q&A. So I think just one more question, no, two more questions have come up. Can we combine the intermediate and the main conclusion here and still get and? I'm not really sure what you mean here. When you say combine the intermediate and main conclusion, see, the intermediate and main conclusion do not agree with each other. That's the main thing that you want to consider, that the intermediate conclusion, which is the analyst conclusion, is that half the reported cases are bogus. The main conclusion has nothing to do with that. The main conclusion is that the analysts are wrong. And that can be the conclusion. The conclusion can always just be that somebody is wrong, right? You can give data showing why somebody is wrong, but the conclusion can be, hey, this person is wrong, right? And that's pretty much it. Every statement can be put in these quadrants, right? So you want to like identify the statements and identify a statement, put it in a quadrant, look at the answer options and see whether the answer options match the quadrant. You do that by, breaking down the code. If you see data, that's a premise. You see observation, that's a premise. You see conclusion, that's a conclusion, obviously. You see position, that's a conclusion, right? You see supporting, that's a premise. You see being supported, that's a conclusion. All of this is code that you can pick up with through practice. So now let's come back to that first question and the one that we looked at right at the start of the session and see how we might answer it, right? What I'm going to do is I'm going to open up the second poll, which says questions, right? And it says 1 easy, 2 tricky, and 3 challenging. All right. So for this 1 easy, I want you to answer, right? I've given options A, B, C, D, E. So I'm going to launch the polling. When you feel like you can answer this question, go ahead and mark in the easy category the answer that you think is right for this question. I'm going to give you 2 minutes for it, and then we can get started. All right. I think it's been 2 minutes or so to answer the question. I see that people still haven't marked answers in on the polls, so could be something to that. I think that people have just answered it on the chat, so fair enough. You know what? I think if that works, that helps. Okay, so I see that a bunch of people have answered E. All right. Unable to submit the poll. You know what? We'll just use the chat. I think that's fine, a bit more informal anyway. Okay, so let's take a look at what the statements say, right? Now, what is the author trying to convince us of here? First of all, are there even multiple conclusions? Not really, right? At the end of the day, what we saw is that, you know, the only thing that the author is trying to convince us of is the fact that the fragments, that we didn't know how big the fragments were, and they tried to do some analysis. The conclusion was that some of the fragments were large enough to have passed through the outer atmosphere, right? That, or rather that, what was the size? They were large enough to have passed through the outer atmosphere without being burned up. So in other words, fairly large, right? So ultimately, the second statement is the main conclusion of the argument. Fantastic. Now that we know that, let's take a look at what the options have to say and whether we can eliminate things. The second is a part of that explanation. Now, an explanation for something is generally a conclusion, because if you're trying to explain something, you have to give reasoning, you have to give some, you know, some backing as to why, like you get data, you explain the data. So that the second is usually explanation, so would be a conclusion. But part of that explanation is not correct. It is the entire conclusion itself. So great, that helps us quite a bit. We can then go ahead and get rid of answer option A. B says the second is that conclusion. Okay, so weighs against the conclusion of the argument. The second is that conclusion. Okay, so conclusion works. Let's just keep that in mind. C says the second provides evidence in support of that conclusion. Again, evidence in support of that conclusion is premise support. It's not main conclusion itself. So we can go ahead and get rid of C. D says the second acknowledges a consideration that weighs against that conclusion. And now you know the word consideration is code for premise, right? Because consideration weighing against the conclusion means that it would be a premise. That doesn't help us either. That goes out. The second is that conclusion. Okay, that works. Great. So now we're already just down to B and E. Now let's see what option A says. Sorry, not what option A says, what statement 1 says. The fragments themselves almost certainly contain no sulfur, but many astronomers believe that the cloud layer below Jupiter's atmosphere does contain sulfur. So why are they talking about, you know, whether Jupiter contains sulfur or not? They're talking about this because later on they use the sulfur thing to say that the fragments were big enough. So they bring up this sulfur thing ultimately to support the idea of the conclusion. They're talking about the sulfur to later tell you, hey, look, that sulfur thing was relevant. And as a result, we know what the size of the fragments were. We know that the fragments ended up being pretty big as a result of whatever we looked at. So now we know that the first statement can be put into the category of premise support. What does B say? B is a consideration. Consideration is a premise. Great, that works for us. That weighs against the conclusion of the argument. Certainly not, right? It's not premise against. So B goes. That all we're left with is E. E has to be the right answer. Let's just confirm it though. The first is a judgment advanced in support of the conclusion. Fantastic. And now you know the word judgment is related to premises, right? And that's it, right? It looked like a long question to start with. It looked like there was a lot going on, but ultimately all you had to do was identify, well, statement 2 was the main conclusion, and that immediately eliminated 3 of the answer choices. All you had to do then was, you know, figure out that the first statement supported the conclusion and was not against it. Putting the statements into the quadrant is a super effective way of breaking down the challenge presented to you by such a question. Now, all of you, oh, I see that the poll can be submitted only once all 3 questions can be answered. That means that that's on me then, right, with the poll. So you know what, forget answering the poll. It's all right. right? You can just put answers in on the chat. I think if that's how that works, that probably works well. And those of you who did put in E, right? All of you who answered it on the chat did answer E, and you're all correct, right? So this is absolutely doable. It is absolutely a matter of just breaking stuff down. I see a couple of questions that have come in. Do you, so Varun asks, do you also have to keep in mind the other premises once we have identified the main conclusion, or do we just directly compare the boldface portion with the options? We just have to compare the boldface portion. The reason I looked at other premises, in the other, in the, other questions was just, to give you a sense of the fact that it can be done even if the question is different, right? It's still, you just have to look at the boldface questions. Sparsh has asked, what is meant by circumstance in option A and judgment in option E? So a circumstance would be an occurrence, right? A circumstance would be some kind of data. And it says circumstance for which the astronomer offers an explanation. So if it is something that needs to be explained, it would be a premise. The explanation would be the conclusion. In E as well, it says the first is a judgment advanced in support. So that means the judgment is doing the supporting. That means the judgment is a premise. That is how you identify the statements as premises or conclusions. If it does the supporting, right, then it's a premise. If an explanation is proffered for it, it's a premise. If it is the explanation, it's a conclusion. If it is supported, it's the conclusion, right? This is stuff that, now that you've done this one question, you'll remember. You'll see this being used, as you go along. All right, there's another question now that is a little bit more tricky. All right, here too, I would like for you to, take 2 minutes. So it's now, 9:09 or 9:10. At 9:12, put your answers in the meantime. We'll discuss how to answer this. All right, now that we've had a couple of minutes, I see some answers coming in with some E's and D's. Interesting. Some E's, some D's. All right. Mostly E's and D's, but a C as well. Okay, so a lot of E's, right? Let's now try and break down what the argument says. None of you picked A and B. Okay, great. That means that that's something we can probably eliminate to start with. But let's see what the statements are saying, right? So what is the overall conclusion here, right? City hospital, the uninsured patients tend to have shorter stays and fewer procedures. And even though the insured patients actually have fewer problems as a whole, right? That would be a premise. Critics of the hospital have concluded that uninsured patients are not receiving proper medical care. Great, so we've been told that that's a conclusion, right? Because it's literally saying critics have concluded, right? And they're not saying critics have concluded correctly or critics have proved anything like that. This is the conclusion. This is the idea. This is the explanation that the critics of the hospital have concluded. However, this conclusion is almost certainly false. Okay, so the city official, right, the person saying this stuff, and it says city official's argument. So we know that what the city official's point of view is the main point of view, right? This conclusion is almost certainly false. Careful investigation has recently shown two things. Insured patients have much longer stays and they tend to have more procedures performed. Since it has shown these things, these are just facts again, so these would be premises. So what is the city official's conclusion, right? What is the conclusion? It's really that the other people are wrong. That's what it is, right? Uninsured, so critics have said that uninsured people are not receiving proper medical care. The city official is saying, no, that's not really what's happened. These people are wrong, right? The city official has not stated his or her conclusion very directly. All the city official's conclusion is that, hey, you guys aren't right. You guys are not right, because that's what they're trying to convince us of. What they're trying to convince us of is that uninsured patients are not, it's not that uninsured patients are not receiving proper care. They're trying to convince us that that's not true, right? And that ultimately would be the overall conclusion of the argument. So, this sometimes it doesn't feel like it's like there's enough data, there's not enough meat on it for it to feel like a conclusion, right? But to say that somebody's conclusion is incorrect is in itself a conclusion. And it is something that you can use. So therefore, the first statement is a conclusion. The second statement, also a conclusion, right? Let's start with statement one. We know that the statement one is the critics of the hospital's conclusion, right? At least we know that. And we know now that it's a conclusion that's the critics of the hospital. It's against the city official. So we know that it's conclusion against. The first states the conclusion of the city official's argument out. The first is used to support the conclusion of the, even worse, that's out. Great, so that's why nobody ended up picking A or B, right? C says the first is used to support the conclusion drawn by hospital critics. Now somebody did pick option C. What I would say though is that there's a slight problem here. The first is the conclusion of the critics. It's not supporting the conclusion drawn. If we're supporting the conclusion, what supports a conclusion? It's premises. What is the conclusion would be the conclusion itself. It would be the position. It would be the point. It would be the position. It would be the claim of these people. If it's supporting any of those things, it's a premise. And it's for that reason that we can go ahead and get rid of C as well. Fantastic. So C is also out, even because it's premise against is what this is saying, but we're looking for conclusion against. The first was used to support the conclusion drawn by the hospital critics. Oh, that's saying the same thing. So D is out as well. And you know what? That makes E the right answer. Just on statement one, we identified that there was a problem with A, B, C, and D, and E has to be the right answer here, right? So what was the challenge with this question? By the way, this is not the easiest question in the world. This is considered a challenging question. If you're looking to get a 700, these are the kinds of questions that you would have to get correct, right? And it would be that kind of, on that kind of level. But many of you solved it correctly. Right? Many of you went ahead and straight up marked answer option C. I see that there are a couple more people who were, answer option E. I see that a couple more people who were confused with C and one person who marked D. But really, A and B were out. The question was, support the conclusion drawn by the critics or is the conclusion of the critics? And support the conclusion means that it goes in the category of premise. But what we see here is that it is the conclusion. They have concluded that so and so and so. And really, that's what it is. It is identifying the nuance between a premise and conclusion and identifying the nuance between what does the supporting and what is supported. Once you do that effectively, you will not be put in a position where you would get confused. I didn't even look at the second statement. Let's look at the second statement for C, D, and E, right? Because we know that A and B don't make sense at all. The second states the position that the city official's argument opposes. No, the second states the position of the city official. The second is what the city official herself is trying to tell us. The second provides support for the conclusion of the city official's argument. So here, the right answer is that they are both conclusions. Option D is saying that they were both premises. Premise against, premise support. But really, it was conclusion against, conclusion support, right? So now we know that supporting, done by premises, supported, done by conclusion. I'm not kidding you. So many of you got this question right. So many of you may have felt, hey, this is kind of straightforward, right? What was the big deal? That's because you understood this technique, right? This is actually considered a challenging question. But if you can break it down like this, it becomes so much easier. Now let's take a look at this final question, and partly for time reasons, but also because of the challenging nature of it, I'm not going to ask you to solve the question itself. I'm going to go over this question, go over this question with you guys. Somebody has also asked which section has the lowest number of questions. Generally CR, but don't bank on it. Don't bank on it. Like I wouldn't say for sure that CR is the fewest questions. On average, it tends to have the fewest questions, but your test could have any makeup. And it's totally random. There's no way to, game it or mechanize it or predict it in any way. It's just random. But okay, let's take a look at this question. And I would say that this is one of those truly, like 750 level kind of difficulty questions. It's one of those questions that, really, really, really pushes you to the limit here. So somebody has also asked, supported is conclusion. Is it? No, supported is conclusion. Supporting is done by premises, right? So if it says something used to support a conclusion, that's a premise. If it is something that is supported by a data, then it is a conclusion. All right. So let's come to this final question. Genuinely challenging, considered, this like clearly above 700. If you get these questions right on a regular basis, you're pushing for the absolute upper echelons of, of the GMAT scores you can get. Let's see what it says. So there's a historian, right? And even if you look at the question statement, right? It says in the historian's reasoning. So we know that the historian's argument, right? That's what we're looking at. Newton developed mathematical concepts and techniques that are fundamental to modern calculus. Okay, so that's just a statement. That's just something that's a true fact. Let's come back to that system of purple for premise, and let's put that in purple. Right, so how about that? That's not right. My bad. Yeah. So let's put this in purple. Okay. Leibniz developed closely analogous concepts and techniques. Okay, that too is just a fact. Let's put that in purple as well. Nice. Okay. It has traditionally been thought that these discoveries were independent. Okay, so that's a conclusion. That's something that we don't have data telling us this, right? It's been thought that so-and-so. So it's been believed that so-and-so. It's a point of view of so-and-so, right? So that means that this would be a conclusion. Let's mark that in red. Why not? Magenta, but whatever. Okay. Researchers have, however, discovered notes of Leibniz that discuss one of Newton's books on mathematics. Okay, so that's a premise as well, right? They've discovered something, so that's a fact as well. Let's put that under premise as well. Okay. Several scholars have argued that since the book includes a presentation on Newton's concepts, calculus concepts and techniques, and since the notes were written before Leibniz's own development of calculus concepts and techniques, it is virtually certain that the traditional view is false. Now, this is part premise, part conclusion. Up until here, it remains a premise, right? Since the book contains a presentation, that's a true fact. Since since Newton's notes were written before Leibniz's notes, that's also a fact, right? That's what we're being told, right? Since that we know that to be true. So these two are also premises. It is virtually certain that the traditional view is false. This, however, is a conclusion, right? The traditional view is something. Now we're being told the traditional view is false. So that's another conclusion as well. Great, so we got our two conclusions, right? In general, you would have a conclusion for or you have a conclusion against. So we got our two conclusions, fantastic. We know that that's what they are. A more cautious conclusion than this is called for, however. Wait a second, let's hold up here. Now we've been given two conclusions, but now the author himself is saying a more cautious conclusion is called for. The author himself is saying, look, we can't, the first view is the first view, right? Independent. The second view is that the traditional view is false. presumably that Leibniz copied Newton, because it's saying that Newton did the works before Leibniz. What the author is saying is that, look, it's kind of in between. We have to be cautious. We can't say that Leibniz definitely copied Newton, or we can't say that the traditional view is definitively false. So here, what we have is the rare question in which there are three conclusions. In like 95% of boldface questions, there are just two conclusions. And generally, it would be the main conclusion and one other conclusion. But here, we have three conclusions. Right? And the main conclusion would only be the historian's own conclusion, right? Because it's the historian's reasoning. So the main conclusion is, what is the historian telling us? The historian is telling us that we need to be cautious, right? There's the traditional view. That's not the historian's view. It's that the traditional view is false. That's also not the historian's view. What is the historian's view? A more cautious conclusion is called for, right? We have to be careful. So three conclusions here, very rare, but this can happen. And the good news is that even when this happens, our model of putting the options into quadrants still stands. Our model still stands. It's just that the historian's conclusion would be conclusion main. Everything else would be conclusion other. And that's why I said put against in brackets, because, it may not always be completely against. It could just be a different conclusion. It could just be a conclusion that is not exactly the same. So you can put that in conclusion other. Great. Leibniz's notes are limited to early sections of Newton's book, Principia Mathematica, right? I think that's what it is. Okay. So Leibniz's notes are limited to early sections of Newton's book, sections that precede the ones in which Newton's calculus concepts and techniques are presented. This too is just a finding. This too is just a fact. So this too we can then mark, underlining it again. But really what I want to do is say that this is also a premise. Great. So now that we looked at this entire argument, right? And I'm not saying that you have to do this for every statement. I did this to demonstrate the fact that there weren't just two conclusions, there were three conclusions here. The other thing is this: both of the boldface statements are premises and not conclusions. We hadn't seen a question like that, but know that that is absolutely possible, right? It's not always going to be the case that one of the statements will be a conclusion of some kind. Okay, so now let's try and dive into this, right? What is the first statement? Since the notes were written before Leibniz's own development of calculus concepts and techniques, this has been used to come to this. It is virtually certain that the traditional view is false. So this is the premise, but it doesn't support the author's conclusion. It supports a different conclusion. So premise against. The second statement is also a premise, but this statement supports the cautious conclusion, right? This statement says that, see, look, we can't say for sure that Leibniz copied Newton. Leibniz also did some stuff before. It could have been independent. It could have been copied. We're not like, this is the premise that actually supports the author's argument. So now we have two statements, right? Statement one is in the premise against category. Statement two is in the premise support category. Okay, so let's take a look at statement one first for the options. The first provides evidence in support of the overall position that the historian defends. See, but it's not the position the historian defends. The historian's position is little bit of this, little bit of that. We're actually in the middle. It's not, the position is not that the traditional view is false. And it's for that reason that we can then go ahead and get rid of A. B says this first provides evidence, same as A, so that's out. C says the first provides evidence in support of an intermediate conclusion that is drawn to provide support for the overall. First provides evidence in support of an intermediate conclusion. Let's just at least put that in the mix. I don't want to read the rest. And you know what? I always recommend this. The moment something gets confusing, if it's right up till this point, keep it in. Move on and eliminate stuff that you know is not right, that you know is ridiculous. Because that's the stuff that's always going to be hard. This stuff will be straightforward, so leave it in. D says, the first is evidence that has been used to support a conclusion. All evidence is used to support a conclusion that the historian criticizes. Okay, so it's not the historian's actual conclusion. So D also works. Great. E says, the first is evidence that has been used to support a conclusion. Yeah, okay, same. So E also works. Okay. Good for us, right? We got rid of two options. And even C might be off if we read on ahead, but forget that for now. We'll come back to that later. What does statement 2 say? Statement 2 is premise support. Okay, so let's see what C says. The second provides evidence against that intermediate conclusion. Okay, so what is the intermediate conclusion? Intermediate conclusion that is drawn to provide support for the overall position. The intermediate conclusion is not drawn to provide support for the overall conclusion. The intermediate conclusion is different from the overall conclusion. It cannot support the overall conclusion. And the second provides evidence against that intermediate conclusion, but the intermediate conclusion doesn't support the overall conclusion. So C is also out. D says, the second is evidence offered in support of the historian's own position. Premise, support, fantastic. Evidence, support of the own position. Premise, support, great. The second is further information that substantiates that evidence. So it's further information that substantiates the evidence in the first statement. But the first statement was premise against. If the second one is in line with the first one, then the second one also is premise against. But no, it's actually premise support. And hence we can get rid of option E, leaving us with D as the right answer. Now, as you can see, there were two challenges in this question. One, I think, is, the complex nature of the wording. But two, the fact that there were three conclusions and you had to correctly identify the overall main conclusion of the argument, which is that neither of the other two conclusions were correct. That being said, if you follow the quadrant form, right, you have conclusion main, all other conclusions are conclusion other. All other conclusions are conclusions that are not supporting the main one. And that is ultimately what you want to do whenever you see any conclusion that is not the main conclusion. Remember that you can put every statement into one of these quadrants, and all you got to do is take the statement and see which quadrant it works for. And once you do that effectively, you should be in a substantiates that evidence. That evidence is this evidence over here. When it says substantiates that evidence, it means supports that evidence. So that means it's just saying that the second statement is along the same lines as the first, but we know that that's not really true. So therefore we can eliminate E. Any other questions that have come in on the Q&A? No new questions on that front. So I think that's pretty much it. Thank you all for participating on this webinar. Really appreciate it. I think somebody's asked another question, right? How do you identify the sentence that has traditionally been thought is not a premise, but a conclusion? Okay, so it is traditionally been thought. Somebody has an idea about it. Now, since somebody has an idea about it, right, that hello, can those of you who are here hear me? I think that the session just I lost internet access. If you can hear me, just please type 1. If you can't hear me, type 2. Okay, great. I see that people can hear me. Yeah, so as I was saying, right, that if you're told that it's been thought something, you're being told that something is a point of view. If you're being told that some people believe something, that's a point of view. A point of view will always be a conclusion. A point of view will always be what somebody thinks is true on the basis of information. And therefore, we know it's a conclusion. Now, all of this is very useful for boldface questions. One final thing, and I know I've taken so much of your time, but just one final thing that I want to say is this, right? This is very useful for boldface questions, but this understanding of being able to pick up on what a conclusion is and what a premise is, it will serve you in really good stead when you answer any CR question. Because when you do assumption questions as well, you have to identify what the conclusion is and see how that's impacted. So always a good idea to take a look at, the conclusion of the argument, being able to identify that main conclusion, right? It is a valuable skill that will help you across the board with CR. All right, that's pretty much it. Take it easy, right? Have a great weekend. Hope that you actually have something to make of it, given that you've stayed here. But thank you all so much, right? Have a good night. And I will hopefully see some of you around in class. Hopefully you sign up for the course and, you get to hear more of this kind of content. Take care. Have a wonderful day. Bye-bye.